So let's have a look at the main bar chart actor. Coming to our event graph. Oh, I'm already here. You'll see there's not a huge amount in here. Nothing on event begin play. Everything is just triggered through a custom event. So when we were looking at the data viz widget HUD, I mentioned that we had a custom event, this fade column material. Now, one thing just to bear in mind is that when you do have a custom event and you have variables that you want to pass through, you can just drag them onto the custom event node. So now wherever I call this custom event, I can pass through the data. So that's exactly what's happening here. And then when we are calling that in our widget, we were passing through these figures. So the float that we were taking from the Z scale, and then the one that we were getting from the Google Sheet array, we were passing through those floats, calling that custom event, and there we are. Those are the figures coming through. So what I've done is just immediately as they've come through, I've just set them up as local variables, so start and target, just because I didn't want spaghetti when I was reusing those values in different places. So I have an offset, so the 1.8 offset, if you recall, when we were looking at the conversion between world space and the location in world space and the scale, that minus 360, we had an offset of 1.8. That's just the same thing here. So I'm now adding that to the line, which was our preview line. And that then sets that scale. So the target plus the offset means that this dotted line goes from the ground sphere to the top of the preview highlight. Or actually vice versa, because we have the child at the point of the mesh, and then we're extending down. So it's actually the other way around, just to add a layer of confusion unnecessarily. So that's what's happening there. We're pulling that through, setting the line, which was happening on value changed, if you recall. So we're moving the slider, and this is being fired every time, updating that vertical line. Let me just show you that again, just so you know what we're talking about. So here, the vertical line is going from the ground to the top of the column, and that's happening as I'm dragging. So then beyond that, the second part of the sequence is that we're taking the start and target, which we pass through on a per instance basis. So every spawned hex column actor is doing this independently once their respective figures have been passed through. The start and target are deducted from each other, which gives us a scale difference. And then I'm taking that scale difference, timesing it by -1 to invert it. And then I've just got a simple timeline, which is going from 0 to 1.5 seconds, from a 0 value to 1. So that's just a kind of alpha value. And I'm using that to drive this distance, which is then added to the start value again. So this was what this was the scale from the previous selection, but now I'm adding the difference. So if it's a negative difference, it's going to take it away over a period of 1.5 seconds, rather than interpolating using a finterp. I'm using a timer because I've got way more control over how long things take, and I don't need to qualify the starting point of the timer and having it run on tick. I can just do it here using this timer. So I find that's a much sort of simpler way of handling it. And then updating the column again. So that is doing all the kind of animation and tweening from the previous position to the new position, taking in that data. Now, another thing that we're doing here is then affecting the color of the column by creating a dynamic material instance and changing the status color vector parameter. I'm also affecting the fade of that color here, again using a timeline. So this functionality here is pretty much identical, but I couldn't put that into a function, a separate function, because it has a timeline in it, and you can't have timelines in functions from here. So I've just set it up and repeated it 3 times. No big deal. And these parameters change based on whether the start and target are equal to each other, where the columns flash grey because there's been no change, whether or not the start is larger than the target, in which case we are moving up and scaling up and therefore changing the colour of the column to green, or this sort of turquoisey bluey green in terms of styling. And then if it's the other way around, we are making it the sort of deep pink when it's, or sort of reddish pink when it's affected by the post-process. So when we were looking at the data viz slider, I mentioned the fade highlight, and it was still implemented, but I had it on play. Therefore, when it played once, it wasn't repeating, and it wasn't firing, because play doesn't mean play from start. If I wanted to play from start, then every time I change the value on the slider, this would then trigger and then gives you a slightly different result. I'll show you what I mean. I don't particularly like it. I think I prefer the snapping. So you'll see that now the columns move, and when I stop, the hexagons fade up. So maybe the timing isn't quite right. I think it's just over a second. So, that's what it's doing. I think in terms of actually giving the user feedback, I prefer it just snapping and therefore removing that fade altogether, because now when I just move it, everything snaps, moves up. There's no fade involved other than the column Z scale matching. So I kind of preferred that, hence disabling it. So just to explain what that custom event was in the data viz slider HUD. And then the only other custom event is where we are affecting the texture of the material. So I mentioned that this is an update actually from the previous video. You'll see now, as we have the column, we have those fades, but then when I click this first checkbox, we now have a world-aligned texture. So when I'm changing the columns, you can see that the columns are changing, but the texture is still in place. And that's just using a world-aligned texture instead of a texture that is scaling with the mesh, because it's basically the UVs are stretching, so it's stretching the texture. By having a world-aligned texture, the mesh can change size, but the texture is aligned to the world, as is implied. And then we just had a second checkbox there that just changed the scale, if I can get it to work. There's some logic there that's not quite working. So it's just a smaller scale. Same principle, same texture in fact, but I've just changed the scale. So again, all of these now absolutely align across columns, so you kind of get a visual reference as to, here it's 4 units basically, whereas here it's 3 3/4. So just in terms of giving you some kind of visual clarity in terms of what you're looking at. by using the well-aligned texture, it's just much clearer. And that is it for the hex column actor, which is instanced and then controlled by passing variables through to a custom event. So hopefully that's of use. If these videos are giving you some value, then please do like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. So thank you for your support.
Live long and prosper.